The Heart Association says replacing saturated fats found in coconut oil or butter with vegetable oils like corn or peanut oil can lower cardiovascular disease by about 30%. That's about the same amount as a cholesterol-lowering statin drug.
Saturated fat raises the LDL, or the bad cholesterol, so coconut oil is going to have that same effect as butter. And
so if you see saturated fat, avoid it.
Exactly.
LDL cholesterol, or bad cholesterol, can stick to the walls of your arteries and cause blockages, preventing blood from getting to the heart and increasing your chances of a heart attack or stroke.
For decades, we've been handed a very simple, very scary story. Eating saturated fat raises cholesterol, and that cholesterol clogs your arteries like fat clogging a kitchen pipe. That grease in the pipes narrative survives because it is simple, not because it is true. Think about it. Yes, if you pour cold bacon grease down a cold kitchen drain, it congeals. But you're not a cold kitchen sink. You are a warm, well-regulated, high-flow biological system. Human core body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Saturated fats like butter and tallow melt at that temperature. They don't sit in a warm, high-pressure environment and decide to be plumbing sealants. You want to know what actually clogs the system? Well, do the other half of the experiment. Take a teaspoon of sugar, add a drop of water and rub it between your fingers. It's sticky, gummy and adhesive. When you have chronically high blood sugar, it binds to protein in a process known as glycation. I talked about that before. So it makes the protein not work well or not work at all. Pipe clogging story fits sugar far better than it fits saturated fat. And the massive outcome data backs this up. Major systemic reviews like the Siri-Tarino study in 2010, a meta-analysis that looked at hundreds of thousands of patients and concluded that there is zero significant evidence that saturated fat intake is associated with higher risk of heart disease or stroke. If LDL is just a toxic sludge that saturates your blood vessels, why doesn't heart disease happen uniformly everywhere in the body? Why do we see plaque in very specific areas while the rest of the vascular system remains perfectly clean? Well, welcome back to Healthier Now, where today we're taking a sledgehammer to the mainstream cholesterol narrative. We're going to look at the actual mechanics of heart disease, massive population data the establishment ignores, and why the steak on your plate is not the problem. First, let's get some terms straight. When the doctor says to you, good or bad cholesterol, he's not actually talking about cholesterol. He's talking about the lipoproteins, because HDL stands for high density lipoprotein and LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. They're lipoproteins. Think of them as boats that carry the cholesterol. Cholesterol is a vital life-sustaining lipid. It forms the structural membrane of every cell of your body. It is the mandatory building block for synthesizing vitamin D from the sun. And it is the precursor to the sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, testosterone. Your body cannot survive without it. It's the cargo, but because blood is mostly water and fat and water don't mix, then what happens to happen is it has to go in the boat, the lipoprotein. So cholesterol needs a boat to carry it through your body. Okay, so LDL and HDL are simply the delivery trucks. Labeling LDL as bad is like labeling a delivery truck as bad. Just because you saw it parked near a crime scene, which brings us to the scene of the crime, your arteries. If LDL were a simple poison, we would see a uniform coat of plaque throughout the entire 60,000 miles of your vascular system, but we don't. Plaque is highly selective. It almost exclusively happens in bifurcations, where arteries split in two and on sharp curves because of hemodynamic stress. In straight arteries, blood flow is smooth, but at branches and bends, the flow becomes turbulent. This mechanical stress can physically damage the delicate lining of your arteries. Here is the ultimate proof. Veins carry the exact same blood, the exact same LDL particles, and the exact same inflammatory markers as your arteries. Yet veins almost never develop atherosclerosis. Why? Because they develop under low pressure. There is no turbulent damage. The only time a vein develops plaque is if a surgeon grafts it into your heart as a bypass. Suddenly, that vein is subjected to high arterial pressure. It gets damaged, and then it develops plaque. The LDL didn't change. The environment did. And that's why you have to get straight. That's not the LDL, it's the environment that changed. In fact, this lines up perfectly with the thrombotic theory of heart disease and the work of researchers like Vladimir Subotin. He points out that the real vulnerability lies in the vasa vasorum, okay? The microscopic blood vessels that supply blood to the arterial walls themselves. When you have high blood pressure, turbulent flow, and metabolic dysfunction, these microvessels become compromised. The arterial wall effectively starts suffocating and dying from the inside out. The cholesterol that forms isn't just cholesterol randomly sticking to the wall like butter sticking to toast. It's a desperate biological response to a catastrophic injury. There is a reason why the medical community refers to these plaques as atherosclerotic lesions. By definition, a lesion is an area of damaged tissue caused by injury. You are not going to have plaque accumulate if you do not have damage to the artery itself. So why is LDL found in the plaque? Because your body is trying to heal itself. When the arterial wall is damaged, the body sends LDL to deliver the lipids and nutrients required for cellular repair. Blaming cholesterol for plaque is like walking into a house fire, seeing firefighters there and concluding that the firefighters caused the fire. There is a massive difference between a molecule being present in a pathological process and a molecule causing a pathology. People in the mainstream love to say, well, LDL is bad in the wrong metabolic context. Oh, really? Does the LDL molecule magically develop moral agency when your insulin rises? Does it magically look around, notice you're metabolically unhealthy, and suddenly decide to attack the artery? No, the environment became damaging. The LDL is just a repair crew getting caught in the crossfire. But don't just take my word for it. Let's look at a massive population level data that actually tells us about cholesterol and your risk of dying. In 2019, the journal Scientific Reports published a massive study out of South Korea looking at 12.8 million adults. They found a clear J-shaped curve regarding total cholesterol and all-cause mortality. The people with the lowest cholesterol levels had the highest risk of dying. The sweet spot for the lowest risk of mortality sat at around 193 milligrams per deciliter, or 5.0 millimoles per litre. And before anyone says, oh well, that's just genetics or an Asian diet, the researchers looked at the Norwegian Hunt 2 study, over 500,000 person years of data. Different continents, different diets, different gene pool. They found the exact same inconvenient truth. Risk of death was higher when total cholesterol dropped below that 5.0 threshold. And what happens when we get older? A 2016 systematic review published in the BMJ Open looked at over 68,000 elderly participants, okay? Their conclusion, what was it? In 92% of participants where an association was recorded, having higher LDL cholesterol was associated with living longer. But here's where the mainstream advice completely contradicts itself. Health guidelines like those from the UK's NHS tell you to keep your total cholesterol under 193 milligrams per deciliter and LDL below 116 milligrams per deciliter. Do the math. LDL makes up the majority of your total cholesterol. If you actively drug yourself to hit that figure, the low LDL target, you are almost inevitably driving your total cholesterol well below the 193 threshold. You are pushing your body out of the lowest risk survival zone and into the higher risk mortality zone. Across at least 4 separate bodies of evidence, the data consistently tells us the same story. Lower cholesterol is associated with higher all-cause mortality. At some point, intellectual honesty requires us to ask, are these guidelines actually protecting us, or are they inadvertently harming us? So how did the entire medical establishment get this so wrong? To find the true origin of this madness, we have to go back to 1913 and to a Russian scientist, Nikolai Anichkov. He force-fed pure cholesterol to rabbits and found that it induced arterial sclerosis. This experiment induced the lipid heart hypothesis. There was one massive glaring problem here, that rabbits are herbivores. They naturally consume exactly 0 cholesterol, and their body has 0 metabolic mechanisms to process it. Drawing conclusions about human heart disease from a cholesterol-fed rabbit is like forcing a lion to eat nothing but grass, and then concluding that grass causes malnutrition in all mammals. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of species-specific metabolism. But the rabbit experiment planted a seed. Fast forward to 1955, the President of the US, Dwight D. Eisenhower, suffered a massive heart attack. The nation panicked. Everyone was demanding to know what was causing this sudden epidemic of heart disease. Enter a scientist named Ancel Keys, and the lipid hypothesis was born. Keys had a very simple, very compelling hypothesis. Eating saturated fat raises cholesterol, and cholesterol clogs your arteries. Following the president's heart attack, Eisenhower's own physician went on television and, heavily influenced by Keys, told the American public they needed to cut down on fat and cholesterol. Almost overnight, a totally unproven hypothesis became a dietary mandate. Keys published the 7-country study, which showed an almost perfect correlation between saturated fat intake and heart disease. The problem? He had data for 22 countries, but he cherry-picked the 7 countries that fitted his hypothesis that saturated fat caused heart disease. If you look at all 22 countries, that perfect correlation vanishes. Yet this flawed data became the foundation of the 1977 Dietary guidelines for the US, and then other countries followed suit. And also 3 Harvard professors were paid off to falsify studies, and one of those three Harvard professors that I talked about before, Mark Hegsted, he became chairman of the 1977 Dietary Guidelines. So they were paid off the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money to falsify studies that saturated fat caused heart disease. We were told to fear animal fats and to replace them with seed oils and refined grains, okay? And then you can find like low fat everything. And people started using like low fat milk over full fat milk, for example, and getting leaner cuts of meat and being afraid of the animal fats. And what happened? Rates of obesity, diabetes and heart disease skyrocketed. Of course, correlation doesn't equal causation. The burden of proof has completely shifted. Mainstream medicine acts like eating a meat-based diet is some crazy dangerous experiment. Let's get real. Eating ruminant meat is not something new and dangerous. We have been eating them for millions of years. So they don't just become harmful all of a sudden. What is new is the cereal oil. What is new is that seed oil in that plastic container. The craziest part about this fear-mongering is that they never told you what meat is made up of. When you pick up a juicy ribeye, you're not just eating a block of saturated fats. A raw ribeye is roughly 63% water and 19% protein. Only about 7% of that ribeye is saturated fat. In fact, a ribeye contains more monounsaturated fat than saturated fat. Okay, the monounsaturated fat, the heart healthy one they'd see in olive oil, it contains more of that than it does of saturated fat. And for the plant-based crowd, or those people just saying that saturated fat is bad in general, here's a plot twist for you, okay? Look at the likes of olive oil and coconut oil. These are healthy fats, but actually coconut oil is over 80% saturated fat. Even olive oil is roughly 14% saturated fat, double the percentage of a raw ribeye. If saturated fat automatically clogs your arteries, then someone urgently needs to go and warn the vegan oil. Now, critics and mainstream defenders love to say that cardiovascular mortality rates actually dropped in the decades that followed. They use this to claim that the dietary guidelines worked, but that is highly misleading. Mortality dropped because emergency services and bypass surgeries got exponentially better, and a huge portion of the population stopped smoking, for example. We got incredibly good at keeping sick people from dying on the floor. But the actual incidence of cardiovascular disease, the underlying metabolic sickness destroying our arteries, that didn't go away. We just traded sudden deaths for chronic, lifelong disease management. We didn't get healthier. We just became profitable, lifelong pharmaceutical patients. And here's the ultimate kicker that the mainstream media barely covered. After terrifying the public for over 50 years, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee quietly revised their stance in 2015 without a major press conference and without apologising for misleading the world for half a century. They quietly removed the warning against dietary cholesterol. They finally admitted that the available evidence shows no appreciable relationship between the cholesterol you eat and the cholesterol in your blood. Yet, your doctor is still probably telling you to avoid red meat and egg yolks. And if you want to know why this narrative is defended so fiercely today, you just have to look at the profits that are made. Lipitor, which is just one cholesterol-lowering statin, has generated over 150 billion in sales. So when a mental model is worth over 150 billion, the industry is not going to let it go quietly. Now, when you point out the flaws of Ancel Keys' epidemiology, defenders of the mainstream narrative will inevitably retreat to their final stronghold. They will say, forget observational epidemiology. We have controlled feeding trials with clear mechanisms proving that saturated fat increases heart disease risk. It sounds like a massive scientific mic drop, but it's actually a massive sleight of hand. Why? Because those feeding trials do not track hard outcomes. Like who actually suffers a cardiovascular event 20 years later. They track short-term surrogate markers, especially LDL spikes, for like short-term, like 4 to 8 weeks. The entire conventional consensus relies on a massive untested assumption that because a food raises your LDL in a 4-week trial, it will inevitably cause atherosclerosis over a lifetime. But here is the fatal flaw in that assumption. There are exactly 0 long-term controlled clinical trials on humans eating a strict ruminant meat diet. Every single trial they quote is based on a mixed diet, meaning that the subjects ate saturated fat with carbs and seed oils. When you look at the clinical reality of people eating a strict ruminant meat diet, their lipid and metabolic profiles shift in a way that completely breaks conventional mixed diet risk models. Yes, LDL often rises because the body has shifted to transporting fat for energy instead of relying on carbohydrates. But look at what else happens. Triglycerides plummet, HDL, the good cholesterol, increases, and systemic inflammation measured by HSCRP drops to near 0. Metabolic syndrome is the undeniable driver of heart disease. If a strict meat diet completely resolves metabolic syndrome, drives inflammation to baseline, and optimizes triglycerides and HDL, betting that an LDL spike will still kill them is an unproven extrapolation. Applying the epidemiology of a sick, mixed diet population to a metabolically pristine, 0 carb state isn't good science, it's dogma. Now, if you take these mortality studies to a mainstream doctor, I can guarantee you they'll shout 2 words at you immediately: reverse causality. They'll say, wait a minute, the people in those studies with the lowest LDL were probably dying of cancer, malnutrition, or sepsis, and those diseases naturally lower your cholesterol. Low LDL didn't cause their death, it was just a marker that they were already sick and frail. But that just proves our point, basically. You see, what they're actually doing by making that argument is proving our point accidentally. They're actually proving our point. They are openly admitting that looking at LDL in a vacuum is completely and utterly scientifically bankrupt. Context is everything. If they can admit that a frail, dying patient with low LDL is a totally different metabolic context than a healthy person with low LDL, they then must also admit that a metabolically thriving carnivore with high LDL is a totally different context than a sick person on a standard American diet with a high LDL. You cannot use a map of New York to navigate London, and you cannot apply the lipid guidelines of a highly processed, insulin-resistant population to someone eating an ancestral meat-based diet. Yet, because of the sheer political momentum, starting by Eisenhower's heart attack, this flawed inference became the bedrock for the 1977 dietary goals. We were told to fear animal fats and replace them with refined grains and seed oils. And what happened? Rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes absolutely skyrocketed. If you eat a meat-based diet, your metabolic engine changes. A rising LDL in the context of excellent triglycerides, sky-high HDL, rock-bottom fasting glucose, and 0 inflammatory markers is an entirely different clinical picture. Your body is using fat for fuel, and it needs those lipoprotein boats to carry that energy. So how do you know that your context is safe? Stop obsessing over one LDL number and look at the real root causes of that arterial damage. Check your HSCRP to measure systemic inflammation. Check your hemoglobin A1C to measure your average blood sugar. Check your triglycerides to HDL ratio. Looking at the triglyceride to HDL ratio is a far better predictor of heart disease than looking at LDL. And if you're truly worried about plaque, then get a CAC scan, coronary artery calcium scan, to see if there's any actual calcified plaque in your arteries in the first place. If you want to protect your heart, you don't need to fear the repair machinery, and you don't need to panic over a number taken out of context. You need to stop feeding the pathology, lower your inflammation, fix your metabolic health, cut the carbs and seed oils, and enjoy your steak. Interpreting a single LDL number in a vacuum is scientifically bankrupt. The medical guidelines were built on a population eating a standard American diet. If you want to protect your heart, you don't need to fear the repair machinery, and you don't need to panic over a number taken out of context. You need to stop feeding the pathology, lower your inflammation, fix your metabolic health, cut the processed foods and seed oils, and enjoy your steak. If you found this video helpful, then make sure to like the video, share, comment, and subscribe to Healthier Now for more truth about human health. And let me know in the comments below, are you still worried about your LDL, or have you ditched the mainstream dogma? Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next video.